invite the very fine Norwegian actress Sara Baban to read it in English.
Resist, my people, resist them. Resist, my people, resist them. In Jerusalem I dressed my wounds and breathed my sorrows, and carried the soul in my palm for an Arab Palestine. I will not succumb to the peaceful solution, never lower my flags until I evict them from my land. I cast them aside for a coming time. Resist, my people, resist them. Resist the settlers' robbery and follow the caravan of martyrs. Shred the disgraceful constitution which imposed degradation and humiliation and deterred us from restoring justice. They burned blameless children. As for Hadil, they sniped her in public, killed her in broad daylight. Resist, my people, resist them. Resist the colonialist onslaught. Pay no mind to his agents among us who chain us with the peaceful illusion. Do not fear doubtful tongues. The truth in your heart is stronger. As long as you resist in a land that has lived through raids and victory. So Ali called from his grave, resist, my rebellious people. Write me a prose on the Ègal wood. My remains have you as a response. Resist, my people. Resist them. Resist, my people. Resist them.
There are so many interesting things connected to this poem. One is, of course, the more general question of the power of poetics in society today. The other is the question of translation, because the case of translation, as I understand it, has been a key thing in the trial against her. How from Arabic into Hebrew it was translated, and that was much of the case is founded on what appears to be a tendentious translation. But before we move into these two things, is there anyone here in the panel that wants to discuss or interpret the poem? I was thinking, I don't know if Per or Jørgen wants to comment on this. This could have been the kind of poem that could have been written in Norway during the war or in different other periods. It's, I see it very much as a sort of honest description of actual, factual, historical things in the political situation. And of course, you can tell us more about, because she's pointing at the different specific sort of cases. And I guess the controversial sentence is this, follow the martyrs, how they choose to interpret it. But the two of you, and also Finn, from the literary side, how do you sort of, what kind of poem do you think it is, and what is she trying to say? How would you interpret the poem? Any one of you three wants to?
I was actually thinking about the war, the Norwegian occupation, while listening to it, and in that sense is a very generic message. It could have been like anywhere, because it's It's a universal message for people experiencing a suppression. That's the case in Palestine today. So it's really, for me, it's generic, and it could be Norwegian occupancy during the Second World War.
I could follow the English translation and the Norwegian translation, and I think it's a strong poem. The parallel to our own occupational history is very clear. At the same time, I can understand why it is conceived as a threatening statement to say follow the martyrs. And we do have legislation here in Norway that prohibits us from inciting violence or violent acts or crimes. And that in itself addresses issues of interpretation and what kind of statement is a statement when it occurs in a poem. And also the notion of freedom of expression. We should think that it would be just as legal or illegal if I uttered this statement here in Norway. So I think unless we want to say that I am not allowed to say these things, then we shouldn't accept that a woman is jailed for saying them in her own environment. But it's a complex. I think the quality of the poem also lies in its richness of complexity.
Yeah, of course, if you take out Jerusalem and Martyr out of the poem, it could be written by almost anybody in a conflict situation or in a war situation because of the rhythm and the general way it asks the people to resist the occupants or the nation who is doing the violence against the people here. But of course, because martyrdom is now very much associated to suicide bombers. It's a general international term in many ways, and that is how it is being interpreted the last decades, perhaps at least since 9/11. It is sort of a word for, and then you can discuss. Does it mean then that if you say follow the martyrs, does it mean that you actually ask the people to use violence against others? And then perhaps you can discuss the problematic issues in the poem. But still, it is only poetry, and in poetry you have metaphors, and I don't know, since it's a problem of translation, we should also, of course, hear what is the actual Arabic word used, and how it is used, and what's the context in the sentences that it has been used.
Can you move on to that?
Yeah.
Because you have translated the poem, I guess, through English and different things. But can you, both of you, then say something about the meaning of some of these words, and both in sort of Arabic, but also the context of these words? Martyrs is one of them. Jerusalem couldn't be that controversial. One must be possible to mention Jerusalem in this poem. But can you say something about the complexity of some of these words? Penna, can you?
Yes, the poem was written in Arabic, and first it was translated by a policeman who is not expert in translation. Of course, he is a policeman, and he had so many misinterpretation. Yes, also he missed few lines, and he made a huge mess out of the poem, and he interpreted it in a way that it will look as if Dareen is inciting to violence. And in her trial, that was what was so interesting in the trial, that they discussed the notion of translation. What is translation? Who can translate a poem? And then the defense brought a professional translator, one that he makes his living from translating from Arabic to Hebrew. And he translated the poem again, and this time not in intention to make it look as if she is inciting, but he just translated it. He didn't know what was the trial about. He was just indifferent. And yes, in the trial they were speaking, like I read the whole protocols because I directed it. For I don't know, maybe 2 hours, they were just speaking about the word shahid. In Arabic, shahid, here you translated it to martyr, and the policeman who translated it just left this word as it is in Arabic, shahid. In Hebrew, the Israelis Jew, use the word shahid as someone who is a terrorist, someone who tried to do something violent and he got killed. But in Arabic, it's not the translation. The real translation of shahid or martyr in Arabic is someone who is dead. And she meant victims. And she mentioned 3 names, and these 3 names are very well-known, how do you say, cases of children or teenagers that were killed, were victims of the Israelis without doing anything. So she was addressing them, the victims, and not terrorists or someone who was intent to do something. They did nothing. One of them, Ali Dawabshe, he was burned while he was asleep by the Israelis. So,
Vibeke?
Yeah, I have the understanding of the word martyr as the same as Einat just said. It's a victim of a conflict or someone who died because of a war against them. It's not only a terrorist. But I had taken some liberties also in the translation because I had done it from English, and unfortunately I don't speak Arabic well enough, even close to well enough to understand or be able to. But from the English, resist my people, to the Norwegian, it's quite far. And I've been through a process in terms of translating and being able or dare to free myself from a text and go into it and make it what's the English? Reinterpret, exactly. Reinterpret the poem. And I feel safe enough to do that when it comes to Palestine because it's so close to my heart. And knowing the situation, knowing the people, nobody I know at least, of course I can't do that as a fact, but I think the Palestinians know too well that a third violent intifada is not the way to go. So I would be surprised if a poet would write a poem that encouraged a violent action. So that's why I made that choice. But I think it's also difficult when it comes to language because we have different definition and we understand different, like God is one of the words we understand in a different way, used often in Palestine everyday life. Here it's a different story. God means something else than there, so it's difficult. Yeah.
You wanted to comment?
Yes. Since the political question is whether or not to put in prison someone who writes a poem in a democratic society. We have we should be able to deal with this sort of questions. Since I was thinking of, you mentioned that I'm a Brecht scholar and a very, as you said, Brecht was on trial in New York on the McCarthy committee, the House Committee of Un-American Activities, and he was. So I mean, we as a collective Western Bund of democracies, we have lived through this before. He was asked, well, Ms. Brecht, isn't it true that you have written some very revolutionary stuff? And he answered saying that, well, I have written some poems and plays in the fight against Hitler, and therefore you may say that the poems are revolutionary because I was for the overthrow of that government. That's not what we were thinking about. And then they read aloud an American translation of his poem Solidaritetslied, the Solidarity Song, and they were chanting this, Richard Nixon and the other guys in the podium. Forward, march on to power, our hunger, it will... Did you write that, Miss Brecht? And he answered, no, I wrote a German poem, but that is very different. And the reaction from the House Committee of Un-American Activities was that they began to laugh. So that is what their reaction should be. And that is the real difference. Because you may have thought that it was rational to stand against a communist threat in America in the late 40s, and you may say that it's rational to try to prevent attacks on civilians in Israel, but even in the climate of the Cold War, these communist hunters, they cracked up laughing. That is the difference.
You want to say something, Vibeke?
Yeah. Because would it matter though if she actually encouraged violence? This is a population who is and has been under occupation and facing the Israeli army for years and years and years and years. I would think it should be okay to stand up and fight for yourself. And should a poet be put in prison for doing that? So I think that should be the question also. I mean, isn't she entitled to say, come on, I don't, accept this anymore? It should be the...
But it's also an example that's an expression, for that expression to be an act. It must be interpreted. And with this key word, we don't know if this is what we Norwegians are doing on the 8th of May, commemorating those who fell in the war against Germany, or if we should associate to crazy people, or people who really want to hurt innocent lives. It seems to me that it could just as well be, let's remember those who gave their lives for our future freedom. But the point is, we cannot, even outside the context of Israel, we cannot really discern spoken words as actions without an interpretation.
Just a response to what Vibeke is saying. First of all, of course, it's very interesting that you have a situation that she's not in prison because of her poem, but because of a policeman's translation. That's a rare situation. I would say I've never heard about anything just like that before. But if she had written a poem which is directly asking the people to take weapon and fight against the oppressors or whatever, then it is in most countries in the world illegal. We have people in prison in Norway because they have asked people to go and fight in ISIS, for example. They have not done anything more than asking people to get up and travel down and take part in the war, which they think it's a truthful war, you know, and they are now sitting in 5 to 8 years in prison. So yeah, actually, in the most of the countries in the world, it's illegal actually to ask people to go and take up weapons or be martyrs in the sense of being a suicide bombers.
Can I just ask you, or
Yes,
do you want to?
can I
Yeah.
just relate to what you said? She didn't ask people to.
That's what I say also.
Okay.
She didn't.
And
I just suppose if she did.
And even if she did, being it was a poetry. So poetry, it's like you cannot say that someone is inciting in poetry because it's poetry. It's we the Israelis Jews, we are singing in Hanukkah, in one of our holidays, such terrible words saying that we must kill all our enemies and terrible things, and nobody is doing anything. So it's, I don't know how to say it, it's the art prevents us. It's not, it cannot be inciting.
That's what it's art. No, but I agree. Of course, there should be some sort of regulations. What you pointed out, I perfectly understand and agree upon. But still, in this context, and as Einar said, it's all about who is in power here, right?
Of course.
That's more about that rather than the quarreling of words, and especially when it's lost in translation.